Hello and welcome to Pulse of Culture. I'm Celia Strzemska, and tonight we're going to talk about The Brutalist. The film is a saga of bold men with even bolder visions. It tackles big themes like the clash between art and commerce, privilege and marginalization, but perhaps the most powerful statement comes from the buildings and designs themselves. After all, brutalism was a defining force in modernist architecture. And tonight we're joined by Kuba Snopek, urban designer, researcher and teacher, whose work dives deep into the intersection of architecture, history and sociopolitics. Hi, welcome to the show. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you.
So let's start with the movie. Immediately after I left the movie theater, I Googled the main character. It turns out, of course, that he was a fictional character, but I wanted to ask you about some inspirations behind this.
I also Googled because I thought it's impossible that I didn't know this guy. But I think that the main character was the building and brutalism. The architect who is depicted in the movie, he is more like a collage of very many stories. You could say maybe he's somehow connected to Marcel Breuer, he was born in Europe. He was a Hungarian-German architect. He also emigrated to the United States, although, as I remember, he emigrated before the war started. And he might have been an inspiration for the main character of the movie.
Okay, right. There was this chair that sort of was very similar to the Vasily chair that Breuer designed, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean, going back to brutalism as a trend in architecture, what makes a building brutalist?
So I was trying to find a definition, and there are so many definitions that every time you find, an article about brutalism, in the comment section, the first comment says, this is not brutalism. So I would say, I think that there is a common sense definition that every time you see a building, which is, you come to Europe and you see a row of like gingerbread houses, colorful and cute, and then there's something that is bigger, that is very dramatic, that is abstract, that is probably from the 50s or the 60s. And the most important thing, it's made of raw concrete. I think that there is a high probability that you have stumbled upon a brutalist building. And you can find them all over the world. You can find them, in the United States, they are the public buildings like the FBI building or the Boston City Hall. You can find them as council housing in London. You can find them in Poland.
I was actually going to ask you, do you have a favorite one here in Poland, perhaps?
I think that my favorite one is called Bunker Sztuki, the Bunker of Art in Krakow. In general, if I was going for a brutalism trip in Poland, I would go south. I would go to Krakow, Katowice, Wrocław. And the Bunker of Art is very close to the historic center of Krakow. It is a space devoted to art. And it's juxtaposed against the historical environment. And I think that this is a very, very beautiful space that you can see this brutalist building, which is very nicely composed into the historical setting, which typically is a problem. In there, it actually came out really, really well.
Right, because sometimes these buildings, they do not survive, right? And that was the case with the railway station in Katowice, also in southern Poland. So I wanted to ask you, because in the film, one of the main themes is this sort of, clash, right, between art and the utilitarian purpose, the sort of industrialization and commerce, right? So how do you see it? I mean, which one is more important, and could the railway station in Katowice serve as an example?
So the railway station in Katowice was a building that was created in mid-20th century in the brutalist style, And it wasn't entirely demolished. There is a small piece of it still left. It was taken over by a shopping center, by a commercial center. But there is still like a small part of it which was renovated and composed into this commercial space, so you can go and you can take a look at it. There's another building in Katowice, Super Jednostka, or Super Unit, which is very close, and it's also in brutalist style. You can take a look at this. As for the movie, I think that there's another kind of tension which is extremely interesting. I think that brutalist architecture in general, it's something that the camera likes very much. I have a personal theory that this topic of brutalist architecture was chosen by the filmmakers because of how great it looks in the camera. There is always a lot of concrete with textures, and cameras love textures. There is always a lot of light and a lot of shadow, which also look great. There's also always like a geometrical interior. So when I was watching a movie, I had a feeling that this choice of this particular style was not because of an architect or because of, you know, the importance of brutalism, but because of how great it actually looks in the camera and how great movie you can make out of it.
And you said that one of the defining characteristics of brutalism is the use of concrete. So I wanted to ask you why this particular material?
Well, concrete was a material that was, I think this is like the defining material of the 20th century. It was extremely important, and there was a lot of philosophy around concrete. In the beginning of the 20th century, for example, many architects thought this is going to democratize architecture. It's going to make it possible to build a lot of buildings. So on the one hand, it was an aesthetic choice for very many architects. You know, it just looks great. It's like artificial stone. It has a texture. You can form it as you want. You can make panels. You can make it in situ, like on the location. It always looks differently. But on the other hand, there was also this philosophical background of like, okay, we're building from concrete because this is modernism, because this is democratization, because this is mass architecture, etc. And I think that this ended, it's not like this anymore. In the 80s, when the postmodern architecture came back or came in as the new style, which was very much in opposition to modern architecture, other materials came back, like brick, like colors, like things that are more understandable. And there was a lot of criticism of brutalism and modernism in general that, you know, this is too abstract, nobody understands it, people don't like it, this is not something that we can associate with. I personally like modernism and brutalism, but there is a lot of criticism of the choice of this particular material.
Right, and I wanted to ask you, was there a stark sort of, departure when sort of brutalism appeared from what was before? Because, I mean, there's one scene in a movie which, well, spoiler alert, sort of hints at that with the library, right, that it was sort of completely transformed.
It happened in different time in different places. So, of course, there were places in Europe which were extremely avant-garde in the 20s, and there was a stark departure from the architecture of before, you know, in the 1920s in Germany, in Soviet Russia, in Poland, in France, etc. And then a little bit later, it happened in the US. So I think, yes, there was a moment.
Is it like the Manhattan in Wrocław? I mean,
Manhattan in Wrocław happened later. It's the 1960s. So I think the architects have departed from what had been before many times before Manhattan appeared. And of course, it's always the same discussion. Even today, 100 years after first modern building appeared, even today when you propose something that is abstract, you propose something that is difficult. We have the Museum of Modern Art that has just been built, like, you know, it was opened like 3 months ago, and there was a huge backlash. You know, this is not something that we have expected. So I think that every time architects propose something which is abstract and kind of bound to this idea of modern architecture, there is always part of the population which is not on board with that.
Right, and creativity is one thing, right, when we talk about creating something, buildings in this case, but also schooling is another important part, right? And the alma mater of the main character in the film is a Bauhaus, right? And you've also worked in education as a program director at the Kharkiv School of Architecture. So can you explain to me and to our viewers how important is the curriculum, perhaps the teachers, what sort of, you know, makes a school so formative for architects?
Well, I'm a big believer in education. I think that education is extremely important and schools actually do form architects and do form their way of understanding space and creating. Bauhaus was, like, I was always under the impression that Bauhaus is very much about craft, that craft was extremely important, how you treat the stone, how you treat metal, how you treat other materials. And I think that this was like the part of the curriculum and part of architecture which was like overemphasized in Bauhaus. And even today, when you take a look at designers, you know, like designers of things, of I don't know, Apple, they always go back to Bauhaus as this tradition because of how important the material and the form was. But there were also other, elements of architecture. For example, the social responsibility. I think the most important thing in the last 10 or 20 years is how architecture actually impacts the built environment, the environment and nature. And this is something that is being discussed right now. I think that if something like Bauhaus appeared today, it wouldn't have been about materials, it would be about, you know, nature and environment.
Because it sort of now has to merge into the landscape, right? I believe that's one of the principles, or not? I mean,
you are asking about concrete. There is a huge discussion about concrete today. I mean, like the last several years, because of the negative impact the production of concrete has on the environment. So there has always been a group of people who didn't like concrete because of how it looks. But today there is another group of people who doesn't like concrete or doesn't appreciate concrete because of how huge impact on the environment it actually has as compared to other types of materials.
Right, so what would be the most environmentally conscious choice, right? I mean, which material would...
I personally don't know, and I think nobody knows. This is the ongoing discussion right now, like everybody has an opinion about this.
Right, but what if the building is repurposed for, you know, serves another purpose, you know, nowadays than it used to?
Well, this is something that has been happening a lot, and I think that this is also one of the things that is being discussed in the architectural world today. How much do we repurpose and how much we should be repurposing? Again, the environmental issues. Instead of destroying buildings, let's adapt them to newer uses, other uses, and let's build already buildings that can be adapted. Because sometimes you create a building that has a form that only fits one function. But today there is, I think, a consensus already that you should build things that can be adapted to other uses later.
Can you think of an example, perhaps here in Poland, of a building that was repurposed to, you know, to serve in a different form?
I mean, I think that the vast majority of industrial buildings in Poland, of course, Poland remains an industrial country, and we still have a lot of industry, but it has a different form. But there's a huge number of buildings from the 19th and 20th century which have been repurposed for completely different uses, like apartments, commercial, etc.
Okay, just a short answer to my last question. What about buildings that were rebuilt, that were destroyed and rebuilt? Do they still count as, you know, as important pieces?
I think, you know, in Poland, you could argue that yes. I personally, I'm not a big fan of reconstructions. However, we are in Warsaw right now, so please come to Warsaw to take a look at the old town, which was completely reconstructed from the ashes. And also an interesting thing, it was brought to the UNESCO list after it was reconstructed. So typically, the buildings on the UNESCO list are ones that are original, authentic. But the Warsaw Old Town was destroyed completely, and the reconstruction was so huge that the act of reconstruction and the fact that it was actually done
itself, right?
It is heritage itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, yes, the Old Town is certainly worth visiting. Kuba Snopek, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching Pulse of Culture. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.